The fog that rolled off the Atlantic Ocean that evening did not move like weather. It moved like a living thing. It swallowed the jagged coastline of Rhode Island, erasing the horizon line where the gray water met the gray sky, until the world outside the Thorne Estate was nothing but a wall of impenetrable white mist. Inside the library of the great house, the air was still. It was a stillness that felt curated, preserved under glass, smelling of beeswax, old leather, and the slow, sweet decay of paper. Jane stood on a rolling ladder, her hands encased in white cotton gloves. At 28, Jane had spent more time in the company of the dead than the living. She was an archivist, a restorer of things that time had tried to destroy. She was not a woman who drew attention to herself. She wore colors that blended into the woodwork, browns, creams, soft grays, and moved with a quiet economy of motion, as if she were afraid of disturbing the dust motes dancing in the shafts of fading light. She was tired. Her back ached from hours of cataloging the Thorne family collection. This was her assignment, to index 3,000 rare volumes before they were donated to the Library of Congress. It was a tax write-off for the family, a political maneuver to show their benevolence. To Jane, it felt like an eviction. She carefully pulled a first edition of the Odyssey from the shelf. The spine was cracked, the leather peeling like sunburnt skin. She ran her gloved thumb over the gold lettering, feeling a pang of sympathy for the object. It had been held, read, and loved, and now it was being sent away to a cold, climate-controlled vault where no one would ever touch it again. We stand so still to keep the pedestal from shaking, never realizing that the fall is the only way to touch the ground. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the room creaked open. Jane didn't turn immediately. The house staff usually ignored her, treating her as part of the furniture. She assumed it was a maid coming to draw the heavy velvet curtains against the night. But the footsteps were wrong. They were heavy, deliberate, and paced with a rhythm of exhaustion. They were the steps of a man, carrying a weight he couldn't set down. Jane froze on the ladder, peering through the gap between two shelves. Emmett Thorne walked into the room. He was 35, but in the dim light of the library he looked older. As the state's youngest attorney general, his face was as recognizable as the monuments in Washington, D.C. It was a face carved from granite, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, eyes the color of the Atlantic in winter. He was a man built for podiums and cameras, designed to project strength, stability, and unyielding justice. But here, in the sanctuary of the library, the granite seemed to be cracking. He didn't see her. He walked to the center of the room, loosening his silk tie with a violent, jerky motion as if it were a noose. He tossed his jacket onto a leather armchair and leaned heavily against the massive mahogany desk. He didn't pour a drink. He didn't check his phone. He simply bowed his head, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes, letting out a sound that was half sigh, half groan. It was a sound of utter defeat. Jane watched, holding her breath. She knew she should announce herself. She knew the protocol, but she couldn't move. She was witnessing something forbidden, the statue breathing. She was seeing the ice heart of the Thorne dynasty melting in the privacy of his own home. Emmett dropped his hands and looked up at the ceiling, his expression raw and unguarded. He looked terrified, not of a physical threat, but of the silence. He looked like a man who had been running a marathon for decades and had just realized there was no finish line. He reached out and touched a silver-framed photograph on the desk, a picture of his father, the late senator. He didn't look at it with love. He looked at it with a mixture of reverence and resentment. "I can't do it," he whispered. The words hung in the vast room, fragile and shocking. Jane shifted her weight. The ladder gave a soft, high-pitched squeak. Emmett spun around instantly. The transformation was terrifyingly fast. In the blink of an eye, the exhausted man vanished, replaced by the Attorney General. His posture straightened, his face smoothed into a mask of polite, chilly indifference. His eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows until they landed on her. I wasn't aware I had an audience, Emmett said. His voice was deep, smooth, and utterly cold. It was a voice he used to cross-examine witnesses. Jane stepped down from the ladder, clutching the copy of the Odyssey to her chest like a shield. "I apologize, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She didn't tremble. She was used to handling fragile things, and she realized, with a sudden jolt of insight, that the man standing before her was far more fragile than the book in her hands. "I was just finishing the cataloging for the shelf. I didn't mean to intrude." Emmett walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, looming over her, using his height and his presence to intimidate. Most people shrank away from him. Most people stuttered. "You're the archivist," he stated, dismissing her humanity with a label. "Jane." He knew her name. That surprised her. "Yes, sir," she replied. "You heard me," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an assessment of damage. Jane looked up at him. She didn't lie. She didn't offer a platitude. She looked past the expensive shirt and the political armor, straight into the winter blue eyes that were desperately trying to freeze her out. "I heard a man who was tired, Mr. Thorne," Jane said softly. "I didn't hear anything else." Emmett stared at her. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the fog outside. He was waiting for her to apologize, to scurry away, to fawn over him. But she just stood there, holding a broken book, looking at him with a gaze that was neither judging nor worshipping. It was simply seeing. For the first time in his life, Emmett Thorne felt completely, terrifyingly visible. "Finish the shelf," he commanded, his voice tight, turning on his heel. "And then leave. This room is for history, not for eavesdropping." He walked out, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood, retreating back into the safety of his persona. But Jane remained, clutching the book, feeling the residual heat of his presence and the undeniable, electric truth that had just sparked between the invisible woman and the man who wished he could disappear. Over the next 10 days, the library of the Thorne Estate ceased to be a room and became a borderland. It was a neutral territory between the manicured violence of Emmett's political life and the quiet, dusty solitude of Jane's work. The fog didn't lift. It clung to the windows, turning the sprawling lawns into a gray void, isolating the house from the rest of Rhode Island. Jane continued her work. She set up a station on the long oak table, surrounded by pots of wheat starch paste, Japanese tissue, and bone folders. She was dismantling a crumbling 18th century ledger, reinforcing the spine, stitching the wounds of history back together. Emmett returned every night. He never announced himself. He simply appeared in the doorway around 9 p.m., usually with a glass of amber liquid in his hand and the weight of the state on his shoulders. He would sit in the leather wingback chair in the corner, far enough away to maintain propriety, but close enough that Jane could hear the rhythmic clinking of ice against crystal. They didn't speak much. At first, the silence was jagged, filled with the tension of his authority and her subservience. But slowly, the silence changed. It became companionable. It became a shared exhale. One Tuesday, the air in the room was heavy with the smell of warm glue and old parchment. Emmett had been staring at the fireplace for 20 minutes, his tie undone, a stack of legal briefs ignored on the floor beside him. "You are very meticulous," Emmett said. His voice was low, startling Jane in the quiet. Jane didn't look up from her work. She was using a fine brush to apply adhesive to a tear in a page. "If I rush, I tear the paper, Mr. Thorne. Rush is the enemy of preservation." Emmett stood up. He walked over to the table, the ice in his glass shifting. He loomed over her workspace, his shadow falling across the ledger. "In my world," Emmett murmured, looking down at her hands, "if you don't rush, you are overtaken. Speed is the only currency. We make decisions in seconds that affect lives for decades." "That sounds exhausting," Jane said honestly, setting down her brush. "It's not exhausting." Emmett corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. It's eroding. It scrapes you away until there is nothing left but the function you perform. He places glass on a coaster, a small, disciplined movement. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. Jane looked at his hands. They were powerful, manicured, capable of signing laws and indictments. Yet they looked desperate to hold something real. "Why do you sit here?" Jane asked. It was a bold question, a dangerous one. She was the help, he was the master. Emmett looked at her. His winter blue eyes were no longer freezing. They were thawing, revealing a dark, turbulent water beneath. "Because," he whispered, "you are the only person in this house who isn't trying to vote for me, sue me, or marry me. You just work. It is the only honest thing I see all day. We build walls of marble to impress the world, forgetting that marble is cold to the touch and impossible to sleep against." He reached out. It was a slow, tentative movement. He picked up one of her tools, a small, bone spatula used for smoothing paper. He turned it over in his large hand, examining it as if it were an alien artifact. "You fix things," he said, handing it back to her. Their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, a fleeting collision of skin, but the shock of it went straight to Jane's marrow. His skin was warm, contrasting with the cold reserve of his persona. Emmett didn't pull away immediately. He let his hand hover near hers, a magnetic pull fighting against the polarity of their stations. "I don't fix them," Jane whispered, her breath hitching. "I just stop them from disappearing. I remind the world that they existed." Emmett looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. The intensity of his gaze was suffocating. For a moment, the Attorney General vanished. The Thorne legacy vanished. There was just a man, standing in a dimly lit room, starving for a connection that didn't require a press release. "I feel like I am disappearing," Emmett confessed. The admission was so quiet Jane almost missed it. Everyone sees the Attorney General. No one sees Emmett. "I am being hollowed out, Jane. And I don't know how to stop it." Jane felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. She wanted to reach out and take his hand, to anchor him. But she couldn't. The gap between the archivists and the aristocracy was paved with landmines. "You are not disappearing," she said firmly, holding his gaze. "You are just hidden under the layers they put on you. Like this book. The spine is broken, Mr. Thorne, but the story inside is still intact." Emmett stared at her. A flicker of hope, dangerous, bright hope, lit up his face. He leaned in closer, invading her personal space, smelling of scotch and cedarwood. "Jane," he breathed. The library door swung open. "Emmett, are you in there?" The voice was sharp, cheerful, and piercing. Emmett recoiled as if he had been shot. The vulnerability slammed shut instantly. He straightened his spine, buttoned his jacket, and turned toward the door, his face resetting into the granite mask of the politician. A woman walked in. She was beautiful in a terrifyingly polished way, blonde hair sprayed into submission, a red dress that cost a fortune, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Camilla Vance, the daughter of the Senate Majority Leader. "There you are," Camilla said, walking over to him and placing a possessive hand on his arm. She glanced at Jane with a vague, uninterested politeness one gives to a lamp. "Your mother is looking for you. The donation ceremony details need to be finalized, and we need to discuss the engagement announcement. The press wants a date." Jane felt the blood drain from her face. Engagement. Emmett didn't look at Jane. He couldn't. He looked at Camilla, his jaw tight. "I'll be right there, Camilla," Emmett said, his voice flat. "Good." Camilla beamed. She turned to Jane. "You must be the girl with the books. Make sure you dust them properly. We don't want the photographers sneezing next week." Jane gripped the edge of the table. "I will ensure they are pristine, Miss Vance." Emmett flinched at the tone of Jane's voice, the submission, the retreat. He looked back at her one last time over Camilla's shoulder. His eyes were screaming, but his mouth remained a grim, silent line. He allowed Camilla to lead him out of the library, leaving Jane alone with the glue, the paper, and the devastating realization that while she could repair a 300-year-old book, she could not fix a man who was willingly walking into his own binding. The night of the donation gala arrived with a suffocating pageantry. The fog had not lifted. Instead, it had thickened, pressing against the leaded glass windows of the library like a white curtain, sealing the Thorne Estate into a world of its own. Inside, the house was a cacophony of crystal and ambition. The string quartet playing in the ballroom vibrated through the floorboards, a low, persistent thrum that disturbed the dust in Jane's sanctuary. Jane was not dressed for a gala. She wore her work clothes, a charcoal cardigan and a sensible skirt, because she had been ordered to remain invisible. Her task was to stand by the display case in the library, a silent guardian of the rare manuscripts, ready to answer questions if a donor wandered away from the champagne. She stood by the table, her hands clasped behind her back, watching the door. She told herself she wasn't waiting for him. She told herself that the man who had looked at her with desperate, thawing eyes 2 nights ago was a figment of the library's shadows. But at 8:45 p.m., the heavy oak doors opened. Emmett slipped inside. He was dressed in a tuxedo that fit him like a suit of armor. His hair was perfectly styled, his face shaved and powdered for the cameras. He looked magnificent. He looked dead. He closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling a breath that shook his entire frame. The noise of the party was cut off instantly, replaced by the heavy, accusing silence of the books. "Emmett!" Jane whispered. She shouldn't have used his first name. Not tonight. Not when he looked so much like the senator he was destined to be. "They are waiting for the toast," Emmett said, his voice hollow. He walked toward her, not stopping at the polite distance. He came around the display table, invading her space, driven by a frantic gravity. "Camilla is waiting for the ring. My mother is waiting for the photo op. The governor is waiting for the endorsement." He stopped inches from her. He smelled of expensive scotch and fear. "I can't breathe out there, Jane," he confessed, his blue eyes searching hers, begging for oxygen. "Every hand I shake feels like a handcuff clicking shut." "Then don't go back," Jane said quietly. It was a naive thing to say, and she knew it. Emmett let out a bitter, fractured laugh. "And go where? I am not a man, Jane. I am a corporation. I am a legacy. If I walk away, the whole structure collapses." He reached out, his hand trembling as he cupped her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, a touch so tender it felt like a burn. "But I want to keep you," he whispered, the admission tearing out of him. "I can't lose this room. I can't lose the one place where I don't have to be a statue. Stay, Jane. Stay after the cataloging is done. I'll create a position for you. Curator. Historian. Anything." Jane stiffened. The warmth of his hand turned cold. "You want to keep me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Like a first edition you keep in a glass case. You want to marry Camilla and come here at night to feel human." "I want to survive," Emmett pleaded, leaning his forehead against hers. "Is that so wrong? To want 1 hour of truth in a life of lies? We tell ourselves that love is a shelter, not realizing that hiding someone in the dark is just another way of burying them alive." "It's not wrong to want truth, Emmett," Jane whispered, pulling back, breaking the contact. "It's wrong to ask me to be your secret." The door handle turned. Emmett froze. The panic that flashed across his face wasn't for Jane's safety, it was for his own exposure. He stepped back instantly, smoothing his jacket, his face hardening into granite before the door even opened. Eleanor Thorne walked in. The matriarch of the family wore black velvet and pearls. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed, which was far worse. She closed the door softly behind her, sealing the 3 of them in the room. "The governor is asking for you, Emmett," Eleanor said calmly. Her gaze flickered to Jane, then back to her son. She didn't scream. She didn't acknowledge the intimacy she had interrupted. She simply assessed the threat level. "I was just checking the display," Emmett lied. His voice was steady. The Attorney General had returned. "Of course." Eleanor smiled thinly. She walked over to the table, standing between Jane and Emmett, physically severing the line of sight. "You are very diligent, Emmett, always concerned with the details. But some details are not worth the investment." She turned to Jane. Her eyes were cold, ancient, and terrifyingly perceptive. "Miss Jane," Eleanor said softly, "you have done excellent work, but I think we have cataloged enough for one season. The archives are becoming a distraction." She reached into her clutch and pulled out an envelope. "Your contract is terminated effective immediately," Eleanor said, placing the envelope on the glass display case right on top of the Odyssey. "This includes a generous severance and a recommendation for a position at the Boston Public Library, far away from Rhode Island." Jane looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Emmett. He was standing 6 feet away. He was staring at the floor, his jaw locked tight. He heard his mother firing her. He heard his mother banishing her. "Emmett!" Jane whispered. It was a plea. "Defend me. Claim me. Speak." Emmett looked up. His eyes met hers. In them, she saw a chaotic storm of regret, desire, and cowardice. He wanted to speak. She saw his throat work. She saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. But then he looked at his mother. He looked at the door leading to the gala, to the voters, to the legacy. And he said nothing. He stood perfectly still, a beautiful, tragic statue carved from fear. "Go on, Emmett," Eleanor commanded softly. "Camilla is waiting." Emmett took a breath. He looked at Jane one last time, a look of silent apology that did nothing to stop the bleeding. Then he turned. He walked past his mother. He walked past Jane. He walked out of the library, leaving the door open, letting the noise of the party flood in to drown out the silence of his betrayal. Jane stood alone with the matriarch. "He cares for you, you know," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of malice, stating a simple fact. "That is why he let you go. He knows he cannot protect you from what he has to become. Silence is not just the absence of sound. Sometimes it is the loudest lie we ever tell." Jane reached out and took the envelope. She didn't tear it up. That would be melodramatic. She simply picked it up with the same care she used for damaged books. "He didn't let me go, Mrs. Thorne," Jane said, her voice shaking but clear. "He just forgot to hold on." She walked past the older woman, past the display case of trap stories, and out the side door into the fog. She left the library behind, walking into the cold, damp night, carrying the crushing weight of the realization that the man she had seen as human had decided it was safer to remain stone. The library was silent, but it was no longer a sanctuary. Without Jane, the room felt like a tomb. The air, once smelling of warm glue and purpose, now smelled only of stale champagne and ancient dust. Emmett stood by the display case where his mother had placed the termination envelope. It was gone. Jane was gone. Outside the heavy oak doors, the gala was reaching its crescendo. He could hear the muffled applause, the laughter of the donors, the clinking of glasses toasting to his future. Camilla was out there, waiting for the engagement announcement that would seal the alliance between the Thorne money and the Vance political machine. Emmett looked down at his hands. They were shaking. For 35 years, he had been built to withstand pressure. He was the granite coast against which the waves of scandal and crisis broke. He had survived interrogations, debates, and the crushing weight of his father's ghost. But standing in the empty space where Jane used to work, Emmett realized that the stone wasn't strong, it was just heavy. He looked at the copy of the Odyssey she had been holding. She had fixed the spine. She had saved the story. And he had let her walk out into the fog. "I can't do it," he whispered to the empty room. This time, There was no one to hear him. And that terrified him more than the crowd outside. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the political fallout. For the first time in his life, Emmett Thorne moved without a strategy. He turned away from the door leading to the ballroom. He turned away from the governor, from Camilla, from his mother. He walked to the French doors that opened onto the terrace. He pushed them open and stepped into the blinding white mist of the Rhode Island night. He ran. He didn't wait for the valet. He found his car, parked near the service entrance, and tore out of the driveway, gravel spraying like buckshot. He knew where she would go. There was only one train station running at this hour, a small, desolate platform 3 miles down the coast. The fog was thick, turning the headlights into useless beams of white light. He drove by memory, guided by a panic that felt suspiciously like a heartbeat restarting after a long cardiac arrest. He saw her standing on the platform. Jane was a solitary figure in a gray coat, her suitcase beside her, looking like a ghost waiting for the ferry to the underworld. The station was deserted, the damp air muffling the sound of the distant ocean. Emmett slammed the car door. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet night. Jane turned. When she saw him running toward her, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his hair wild from the wind, she didn't smile. She stepped back, guarding herself. "Go back, Emmett!" she shouted, her voice cracking over the wind. "The train is coming. You have a toast to make." "There is no toast," Emmett gasped, stopping a few feet from her. He was breathless, not from the run, but from the sheer terror of what he was about to do. "I left." "You left the room," Jane corrected, her eyes hard, refusing to let him off the hook. "But you didn't leave the life. You stood there, Emmett. You stood there and watched your mother erase me. You didn't say a word." "I was frozen," Emmett admitted, the shame burning in his chest. "I was trying to protect you. My mother, she destroys things that don't fit the mold. I thought if I let you go, you would be safe from her. From me. I don't need your protection." Jane cried, stepping forward, her anger finally breaking through her reserve. "I needed your voice. I didn't fall in love with the Attorney General, Emmett. I didn't fall in love with the statue. I fell in love with the man who sat in the dark and told me he was afraid of disappearing. The truth of it hung between them, heavy and undeniable. We stand so still to keep the pedestal from shaking, never realizing that the fall is the only way to touch the ground. "I am afraid," Emmett shouted back, stepping into her space, ignoring the boundaries he had respected for weeks. "I am terrified, Jane. I look at my father's picture, and I see a man who died hollow. He had the votes, he had the power, but he was empty. I thought that was the price. I thought to be a Thorne meant you had to carve out your own heart." He reached out, grabbing her hands. His grip was desperate. "But then you walked into the library," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And you looked at me. You didn't see the legacy. You saw the cracks. And instead of looking away, you tried to fix them." Jane looked at his hands holding hers. She saw the desperation in his posture. He wasn't the polished politician anymore. He was a ruin. "If you stay here," Jane warned, her voice softening, "if you are seen with me, the engagement is over. The funding stops. Your mother will destroy you in the press. You will lose the election." "Let me lose," Emmett said. The words came out with a sudden, shocking clarity. He looked at the train tracks, vanishing into the fog. Then he looked at her. "I have spent 35 years winning things I don't want," he said. "I defended the law, but I broke every promise to myself. I don't want to be the statue anymore, Jane. I want to be the man who breathes. But I can't breathe if you get on that train." The rumble of the approaching train vibrated through the platform. The headlight cut through the fog, a blinding eye approaching them. Jane looked at the train. It was her escape. It was her return to safety, to anonymity, to a life where she didn't have to watch the man she loved marry someone else. Then she looked at Emmett. He was shivering in his tuxedo. He had destroyed his night, his reputation, and likely his career, just to stand on a freezing platform and tell her the truth. "You're going to catch a cold," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm already freezing," Emmett replied, stepping closer, until there was no space left between the marble and the artist. "Warm me up." The train screeched into the station, the doors opening with a hiss. No one got off. The conductor looked out, saw the couple standing in the mist, and waited. Jane didn't move toward the doors. She let go of her suitcase handle. "It's going to be a scandal," she said, a small, terrified smile touching her lips. "Good," Emmett breathed, leaning his forehead against hers, the tension in his body finally snapping, leaving him human and whole. "I'm tired of being perfect. Let's be a mess." The train doors hissed shut, the engine roared, and the train pulled away, disappearing into the night, leaving them standing on the platform, stranded in the fog, but finally, undeniably on solid ground. The taillights of the train dissolved into the fog, a pair of red eyes blinking shut for the last time. As the roar of the engine faded, Jane and Emmett were left alone on the damp concrete. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the library. It wasn't heavy with unsaid words. It was vast, empty, and terrifyingly open. Emmett stood there in his damp tuxedo, his hair wild, his expensive shoes ruined by the station's grit. He didn't look like the Attorney General. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck, shaken, stripped of his cargo, but miraculously breathing. "My mother will be calling the press by now," Emmett said, his voice a low rasp. "The gala is over. She will try to patch the crack in the marble before the public sees the ruin underneath. She'll say I had a breakdown. She'll try to drag me back into the stone." "Let her try," Jane whispered, taking his hand. His skin was ice cold, but his grip was immediate and fierce. "You don't have to be the wall that holds her world together anymore, Emmett. Let it crumble." They didn't go back to the estate. Emmett knew that if he stepped foot inside those halls again, the gravity of his legacy would pull him back. They got into his car and drove north, away from the cameras, away from the man he was supposed to be. 3 hours later, the adrenaline began to bleed away. They pulled into a 24-hour diner in Connecticut. The neon sign buzzed with a dying electricity, casting a flickering blue light over the cracked pavement. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee. A waitress with tired eyes didn't even look up as they sat in a corner booth. For the first time in his life, Emmett Thorne was invisible. To the world, he wasn't a titan. He was just a man in a disheveled tuxedo sitting with a woman in a gray cardigan. He stared at the Formica tabletop, tracing a scratch in the surface. "I have nothing to offer you now, Jane," he admitted, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "I left my phone on the dashboard. My accounts will be frozen by morning. I am a pariah. I am a book with the cover torn off." Jane smiled. She reached across the table and covered his hand. "I'm an archivist, Emmett. I don't like new things. I like things that have survived the fire, even if they come out charred. We aren't starting a new book. We're just finally writing the chapter that belongs to us." The transition was not a montage of easy happiness. It was a slow, painful shedding of skin. They settled in a small coastal town in Maine, a place of salt spray and stubborn pines. For the first few months, Emmett struggled. He had spent 35 years being the center of the room, and the anonymity of Maine felt like a sensory deprivation chamber. He had nightmares about his mother's voice calling him from the shadows, telling him he was failing his ancestors. But then, the spring thaw came. In a small storefront near the harbor, they opened the shop. The sign on the door was modest: Thorne and Associates, Restoration and Binding. Emmett had found a different kind of law to follow, the law of the grain in a piece of oak, the law of the drying time for glue. He was no longer a man of speeches. He was a man of silence. He spent his days sanding wood for bookshelves and learning the delicate art of repair from Jane. 6 months later, The sun was streaming through the front window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Jane stood at her workbench, her white gloves moving with the grace of a surgeon as she worked on a 17th-century diary. She heard the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a man walking toward her. But they weren't the footsteps of the Attorney General. They were lighter, paced with a sense of peace. Emmett leaned against the doorframe, wiping sawdust from his hands. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, clothes the senator's son would have never touched. His hair was longer, his skin tanned, and his hands were calloused and strong. He looked younger. The granite hardness of his face had softened into something human. "The glue is dry on the ledger," Emmett said, watching her work with a quiet intensity. "Good," Jane replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "You have a good eye for it, Emmett." "I'm used to waiting," Emmett shrugged. He walked over, standing beside her as a partner. "I waited 35 years to start living. A few hours for glue is nothing." He reached out, his hand hovering over the bone spatula she was using. He remembered the man he used to be, the one who stood in the darkness of the library, terrified that the silence would swallow him. We stand so still to keep the pedestal from shaking, never realizing that the fall is the only way to touch the ground. "I fell, Jane," Emmett whispered, the realization hitting him in the afternoon light. Jane set down her needle and turned to him. She saw the introspection in his winter blue eyes, eyes that were no longer freezing but clear and calm. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. "I spent my life terrified of falling," Emmett said, looking out at the messy, ordinary street outside. "I thought if I moved, the whole dynasty would crash. I thought the pedestal was the only thing keeping me from disappearing. And then I fell. I lost the money. I lost the power. I lost the thorn that everyone feared." He turned back to her, his voice dropping to a tender level. "And I hit the ground. And the ground was you. It was this shop. It was the feeling of sawdust on my skin. I'm not a monument anymore, Jane. I'm just a man." Jane's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that was rough, warm, and real. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "The power? The legacy? You gave it all up for a woman with ink on her fingers." Emmett laughed. It was a deep, rich sound that came from his chest, uninhibited by protocol. He pulled her closer until the smell of cedar and old paper mingled between them. "Jane," he said, pressing his forehead against hers, "I was preserving a corpse in that house. I was binding a book that had no ending. Here, I am simply reading the story as it happens. And it's the only story I ever wanted to be in." He kissed her. It wasn't a kiss for the cameras. It was quiet and steady. It was the kiss of a man who had finally learned that he didn't need to be made of stone to be strong. Outside, the ocean waves continued to crash, reshaping the land, just as love had reshaped them. The Thorne dynasty would continue in the history books as a cold record of ambition. But here, Emmett Thorne was finally unbound. He was no longer a prisoner of his own marble. He was just a man, and as the sun set over the Maine coast, he realized that for the first time in his life, that was more than enough. She was the only one who had looked at the statue and seen the man waiting to be freed, and because she had refused to look away, he had finally found the courage to break himself into 1,000 beautiful human pieces.